It was the summer of 1836, and the sun had begun to rot everything it touched. The fields around Marrow Creek, Georgia, lay in a blistered silence, the kind that presses against your chest. Farmers whispered about the Whitmore estate long before that year. They said the mansion had too many windows but not enough light, that its halls echoed even when no one walked them, and deep beneath it all, buried beneath flagstone and legacy, was a room, sealed, soundless, and nearly forgotten. Until the day the ground cracked open like a wound and exposed what had been hidden. The official story was a sinkhole, that's what the newspapers called it, though few papers were brave enough to print it in the first place. A portion of the estate's western grounds caved in during a thunderstorm, revealing an entrance to what authorities first mistook for a collapsed wine cellar. But what they found instead was silence, carved in stone, a staircase that coiled downward like a throat swallowing secrets. And at the bottom, doors, thick, iron-braced and bolted shut from the outside. The smell hit them first, then the sound, not of screaming, but of nothing at all, a silence so unnatural it made the deputies drop their lanterns. Inside the room were 47 children, or what remained of them. Some sat in corners, their wrists still bound. Others were curled together in strange formations, their faces upturned as if frozen in prayer. The youngest looked no older than 6, the eldest perhaps 13. Not one had made it out. There were no names, no records, only shallow etchings scratched into the stone, marks that resembled calendars or confessions. Later, investigators would count 47 distinct sets of markings. Some had been scratched with fingernails. The Whitmore family was nowhere to be found. The patriarch, Silas Whitmore, was a prominent figure in Georgia's elite social circles. His wealth came from textile exports, his reputation from charity and religious donations. But within days of the discovery, the entire family, Silas, his wife Marion, their 3 sons and 2 daughters, vanished. Their belongings were untouched, meals left on tables, horses still stabled. It was as if they had dissolved. And that is where the official story ends. But the real story, the one buried beneath sermons and soil, beneath the stitched mouths of frightened townsfolk, was never told. It begins not with discovery, but with a contract inked in blood, a promise that every generation of Whitmores was bound to fulfill. And the room beneath the house? It wasn't built to imprison. It was built to feed. The earliest known record of the Whitmore lineage wasn't written in a census. It was hidden in a ledger. Found decades later in the attic of a former Whitmore cousin's estate, the journal detailed transactions, rituals, and something referred to only as the arrangement. Dated 1791, it described a binding pact between Silas Whitmore's grandfather Ezekiel Whitmore and an unnamed entity referred to as the sovereign below. The journal was not written like scripture. It was cold, practical, emotionless. Entries recorded how many youthful voices were offered, what time of year, what state their minds were in before the silence took hold. It was a contract paid in innocence, but one line, scrawled in uneven ink and almost carved into the paper, stood out from the rest. If even one child sings, the whole line must fall. This line explained the room's silence, the chains, the gagging, the starvation. It explained the carvings on the wall, the children's mouths stitched closed with twine or sealed with wax. It wasn't enough to kill. The victims had to be silenced. Any deviation from the ritual, any sound, was seen as a breach. And so, generation after generation, the Whitmore name grew richer, more powerful, more untouchable. They built factories, they founded churches, they sat on boards and councils, but below it all was the room, fed in intervals like a hearth kept alive in winter. No one ever questioned the family's oddities because no one dared. But it wasn't the police or the state that finally brought their story into the light. It was a farmhand named Elias Green, and he had seen what no one else was supposed to survive. Elias Green worked the outer orchards of the Whitmore property, a quiet, hard-backed boy of 19, orphaned young and passed between county homes. Elias had no surname worth defending, but he had eyes and curiosity. One evening, while tending to citrus trees near the house, he heard the rhythmic clink of chains, muffled and mechanical, like a slow windmill turning underground. He followed the sound to a storm grate. What he found should have ended him. Through the rusted bars, Elias saw what looked like a corridor. Not a tunnel dug out of earth, but one built. Stone walls, sconces, even a carved arch with a date, 1811. And in the distance a child, barely moving, tied upright like a scarecrow, eyes rolled upward. Elias ran. He didn't go to the sheriff. He knew better. Small towns in the 1800s were not built for justice, but he went to the only person who might listen, his estranged half-uncle, a preacher named Thomas Braith. Braith didn't believe him at first, but Elias returned 2 days later with something he'd taken from the grate, a small wax doll soaked in blood. That's when Braith knew, because 30 years earlier, when he was a boy, he'd seen the same doll buried in his brother's casket, the brother who had vanished on the Whitmore estate. Braith sent letters, dozens, to newspapers, to state officials, to anyone with a title or a seal. Most were ignored, but one reply came from a certain Colonel Henry Brooks, a retired Civil War officer with a fascination for what he called architectures of death. Together, they formed a plan, not to confront the Whitmores, but to expose the hidden room itself. On August 14, 1836, under cover of a thunderstorm, Elias, Braith, and Colonel Brooks trespassed into the estate's orchard. They carried iron tools, lanterns, and something far more important, a stolen floor plan. Taken from the office of a corrupt local magistrate, it detailed the Whitmore property, including a secret sub-basement not found on any public records. They began to dig. What they found wasn't a floor, it was a lid, a massive stone slab, ringed with nails and iron bolts, stained black from beneath. They pried it open. The air was different. Not musty, but sharp, like burnt copper and old salt. Lanterns struggled to stay lit. The descent was short, only 12 steps down, but each one felt like a mile. The chamber was exactly how Elias remembered it, only now it was empty. No children, no chains, just silence. But something had changed. On the far wall, written in smeared ash or dried blood, was a phrase: "The line is broken." A week later, the sinkhole would open, and everything the state refused to believe would be dumped at their feet. When the sheriff arrived at the scene, 2 deputies behind him, both visibly shaken by the reek, he said only one word: "Close it." The chains, the bones, the claw marks on the walls, the tiny blood-stained clothing, it was too much, too real. But what disturbed him more than the physical evidence was the atmosphere itself. The chamber did not feel abandoned, it felt alert, like something watched them from the cracks. A state investigator was summoned days later. The report he filed was never published, but a carbon copy was found decades later in a retired coroner's attic. Its details were precise, clinical, and damning. He recorded 47 individual remains in various states of decay. Some, mummified by the dry stone and heat, still wore identifiable garments: girls' ribbons, boys' breeches, tiny shoes stitched by hand. Most were restrained. A few had bite marks, human ones, and a handful appeared not to have died from starvation or illness, but blunt force trauma, consistent with panicked beatings. But here's what wasn't in the official version. At the center of the room, hidden beneath a false floor stone, the coroner found a shallow pit. Inside it, fresh bones, not decades old, days, teeth still white. One femur belonged to a child no older than 5. The decay rate suggested someone had placed it there recently. This discovery meant only one thing: someone had been feeding the room, even after the Whitmores disappeared. 3 weeks after the excavation, a local midwife named Constance Bellamy came forward. She was old, nearly blind, and mostly ignored by the town, but her memory was sharp and her records sharper. In her satchel, bound by twine and stained with tea, was a handwritten ledger of every child she'd delivered since 1798. And next to several entries, dozens in fact, were names that had no known birth certificates, no church baptisms, no school enrollments. "We Whitmores took 'em," she said, thumbing through brittle pages. "Pretty ones, quiet ones, paid in gold, always up front." No one had ever listened to Bellamy, not when she warned the church in 1805, not when her own niece vanished after being hired as a maid at the estate. "People think the devil wears horns," she said, spitting into the dirt, "but he wears collars and gives to charities." Bellamy claimed that the Whitmores held winter harvests, rituals conducted every 5 years during the December solstice. Children would vanish, always from outside families. Orphans, illegitimate, unclaimed. She even had names, dozens of them. The state dismissed her as senile, but families across the region began to come forward, mothers who'd lost infants in the night, fathers who'd chased carriages into the woods, only to find hoofprints that ended in ash. Something had stolen these children, and the Whitmore estate had become the mouth that swallowed them. When a team of restoration workers was hired to salvage the upper floors of the Whitmore estate in late 1836, they expected damage, mildew, rot, vermin. What they didn't expect was what they found behind the wallpaper. Layer by layer, century-old paper peeled away, revealing carvings. Hundreds of them, names, dates, symbols, entire phrases etched directly into the wood and plaster beneath the surface. And the strangest part, they were carved from inside the walls. The signatures appeared childlike, jagged, inconsistent, barely legible. But the same names matched Bellamy's records. Ruth, Sammy, Eliza. Some dates were decades apart, others just months. A few phrases reappeared, over and over. "I was good. No singing. He hears through the wood." One wall behind the main stairwell bore a full drawing, a crude, childlike image of a large man in robes holding a lantern, his mouth wide open, with arms stretching down to the floor like roots. Above him were the words, "He lives down there." Authorities halted restoration immediately, but the drawings couldn't be unseen, nor could the fact that one corner of the wall contained new carvings, shallow, freshly cut, made long after the family vanished, made by someone who had stayed behind. An estate lawyer from Savannah named Jeremiah Quinn arrived in Marrow Creek in October of 1836, claiming he had business with the Whitmore estate. A gaunt man with a cane and eyes that scanned too quickly, Quinn presented paperwork no one wanted to see, a deed of inheritance. According to the documents, if the Whitmores could not be found within 90 days, the estate and all ritual obligations contained therein would pass to the closest living male heir. The problem? That heir was already dead, a cousin named William Tolliver, buried in 1832. But Quinn insisted. "Death is not the end of obligation," he wrote, "not in this family." When pushed, he cited passages from a private Whitmore family agreement, one never recorded in state archives, but copied into a bound folio Quinn carried everywhere. In it were references to the heir's silence, a clause requiring successors to either continue the offerings or be offered themselves. Then Quinn vanished. His body was found months later, in a stream outside Charleston. No wounds, no water in his lungs, just a note stitched into the lining of his coat. "The arrangement is not yours to transfer." At the center of the Whitmore estate's parlor was a trapdoor no one had ever noticed. Not until the restoration crew, acting against state orders, pried up a buckled section of the floor. What lay beneath wasn't a root cellar or storage pit, it was a shaft, just wide enough for one person to descend, with rusted iron rungs bolted into the wall, and at the bottom, buried in dust and darkness, was a single iron bell. It didn't look like it belonged in the 1800s, its construction was crude, lopsided, hammered together rather than cast. No engravings, no markings, just a piece of knotted rope and a base made from what appeared to be human jawbones fused in iron. When the crew pulled the rope as a joke, the sound that echoed out wasn't a chime. It was low, hollow, and wet, like air rushing through an empty lung. Every dog in the region howled that night. Lights flickered in homes as far as 7 miles away. The crew never returned. Later reports said one of them, James Kelton, was found 3 days later, walking barefoot along the highway, covered in dust, speaking in a child's voice. He died in an asylum weeks later, after carving the phrase, "Ring and he comes," into his own chest with a spoon. Whatever that bell summoned, it hadn't stopped listening. By winter, investigators turned their attention to the Whitmore family's private chapel, a Gothic structure connected to the main house by a cobblestone corridor. At the center of the chapel sat a massive pipe organ, dusty but intact. It was rumored that Silas Whitmore used to play hymns every Sunday morning for a congregation that never appeared. The keys were made of mother of pearl, and some bore strange discoloration, darker, slick, as if something had soaked into the ivory. A local music teacher named Harland Wicks was invited to examine it. He played one note, a low A, and stopped. "Something's moving in there," he whispered. Inside the organ's largest pipe, wedged behind the metal slats, the children hadn't only been hidden in the walls, they had been played into the very air. The blood stains that returned. After repeated cleaning attempts, the basement walls continued to weep red. State-ordered crews scrubbed the stone, torched it, sealed it with plaster, and painted over it. Still, every full moon, crimson fluid seeped in thin vertical lines from specific stones in the chamber. Lab analysis confirmed it was human blood, but from multiple donors, some of it fresh, some of it, shockingly, decades old, possibly older. At first it was dismissed as condensation mixed with iron in the stone, until a forensic pathologist noticed something odd. Every wall that bled contained names scratched just below the surface, names of children, and each corresponding stream of blood lined up exactly with the location of a child's body during the initial investigation. Even after the remains were removed, the blood still came. It was as though the chamber remembered. Locals began to avoid the property entirely. Even looters stopped coming. Something had changed. The house, once dormant, now breathed again, and every attempt to erase its past only deepened its present. One of the final discoveries came not from the basement or chapel, but from the upstairs study. Inside a false drawer of Silas Whitmore's desk, hidden beneath layers of ledgers and faded baptismal records, investigators found a wax cylinder labeled only, "Don't play this at night." It was a phonograph recording, early even for its time, likely created with custom equipment, meaning the Whitmores had access to experimental technologies long before the public. The cylinder was cracked but recoverable. When played at reduced speed, it revealed a looped recording, low, rhythmic breathing, interrupted by a child's whisper repeating the phrase, "I'm still here, I'm still here, I'm still here." Then, "Sil." Then a different voice, adult, raspy, male, whispered back, "Then be quiet." The phonograph needle snapped at that moment. The cylinder shattered. A technician who digitized the sound for records later quit his job and moved out of state. He left behind one email, sent to a friend the night he finished the transfer. It read, "They're not just echoes, they're trapped." In an old, leather-bound photo album discovered in a trunk under the main staircase, researchers found only one item of note: a black-and-white photograph glued to the inside cover. The image showed the entire Whitmore family: Silas, his wife Marion, their children, standing in front of the estate's porch. Their expressions were cold, unmoved, as was common in early photography. But something was off. Behind them, in the far window of the upstairs nursery, a child was visible. This wouldn't have been strange, except for one fact. None of the Whitmore children matched the face in the glass. The child's eyes were too wide, its skin pale, almost grey, its mouth open, not in speech but in a scream, and its hands were pressed against the inside of the glass, leaving streaks as if trying to claw out. No one could identify the child. When the image was examined under infrared light, something even stranger was revealed. Faint handwriting on the photograph's border, invisible to the naked eye. It read, "You left me behind. I won't forget." Days after the photograph was published in an academic journal, the publisher's office caught fire. No copies survived, except one. And its owner, a collector in Ohio, claimed that every night the glass over the photo fogged from the inside. A regional cartographer named Ezra Finley, obsessed with the mystery of the Whitmore estate, spent nearly 2 years compiling reports, measurements, and hand-drawn maps of the area. But his final breakthrough came from a collapse in said miner's tunnel 3 miles north of the estate. What he discovered, by accident, was another entrance. Beneath a layer of collapsed shale and limestone, Finley uncovered a narrow passage leading into the earth, reinforced with decaying wooden beams marked with the initials WF, Whitmore Foundation. The passage led to a cavernous space where a second chamber, identical in dimensions to the Whitmore basement, had been carved. No bodies, no chains, just an altar. The altar was made from stacked stone, but in the shape of a child curled into the fetal position. It bore no markings, only a hollowed mouth, perfectly circular, like a drain. Finley mapped it. Then he mapped others. Over 5 months, he uncovered 7 more chambers like it, all within a 30-mile radius of the estate, all empty, all silent, and each connected by narrow, ancient tunnels. He published his findings anonymously, then disappeared. The files were sent to a folklore researcher who noticed something chilling. The shape of the tunnels formed a pattern when overlaid on a regional map, a sigil, a calling card. In 1872, long after the estate was officially sealed, a schoolteacher named Clara Hensley took over a one-room schoolhouse on the outskirts of Marrow Creek. Within her first month, 3 of her students went missing. Each had one thing in common. They had recently returned from playing near the ruins of the Whitmore estate. Hensley warned the town council. She described her students' odd behavior before they vanished. Quietness, strange humming, writing backwards in their notebooks. One child drew the same image every day, a staircase going down into darkness, and a lantern held by a faceless man. The council ignored her. But one night, Hensley stayed late to grade papers. She heard whispering beneath the floorboards. When she pressed her ear to the wood, she heard the phrase, "Ring the bell again." She fled. Weeks later, she was found wandering the forest barefoot, clutching a doll, made of wax and hair. Her hands were covered in small bite marks, human but child-sized. She never returned to teaching. An unsigned document, discovered in a locked drawer in the Whitmore Chapel's altar, contained what appeared to be a list of instructions. Titled, "The Ritual of the 5 Silences," it was written in Latin and translated by a scholar at Emory University. The ritual was not metaphorical. It was procedural. Step 1. Bind the mouth. Step 2. Locals began referring to her as the Lady in Red. She appeared only in October, often just before a child disappeared in the surrounding counties. Despite multiple reports, no photographs of her were ever captured. Until 1939, when a local photographer caught a blurred figure in a red cloak standing at the edge of the estate ruins. When the photo was developed, the entire image darkened, except for the cloak. Bright, crimson, untouched by shadow. The film negatives burned a week later in a studio fire, but the image remains in local folklore, along with one whispered detail. Wherever she stood, the ground beneath her always turned cold, even in summer. In 1952, a team of environmental scientists attempted to survey the soil around the Whitmore property for a planned industrial development, but their instruments failed, over and over. Seismic readings were erratic. Ground-penetrating radar showed voids that shifted location between scans. Eventually, one technician went below the estate into the ruins, alone. What he recorded would never be aired publicly. His audio log, recovered from a melted reel, included faint voices. Children whispering, laughing. One voice, distinct, almost calm, said, "We never left. We're just underneath." The technician's boots were later found beside a fissure behind the estate's chapel, their laces perfectly tied. Soil samples taken nearby contained abnormal levels of iron and calcium, suggesting biological material, but more bizarre was the discovery of tree roots that wrapped in perfect spirals, as though grown around something once alive. When dissected, one root contained a child's molar fused into its fibers. Botanists called it a mutation, but older locals had another name: whisper roots. Plants that fed off memory, fear, and buried things. To this day, no vegetation grows properly on the estate, but the roots remain, twisting, alive, always listening. In 1967, a firebrand preacher named Father Ezra Merrow moved to Marrow Creek to cleanse the land of Whitmore filth. A former exorcist from Louisiana, Merrow was known for violent sermons, public fasts, and claims that demons walked in daylight. Locals feared him, but they listened. In his final sermon, preached from the burned steps of the Whitmore Chapel, he screamed, But the most disturbing case was a girl named Amara. During hypnosis, she whispered a phrase over and over: "If one of us speaks, all of us wake up." When asked what that meant, she said, "You only buried our bodies, not the promise." She then bit through her own tongue. In 2001, after decades of silence, the Diocese of Savannah sent an exorcist to the Whitmore site following several reports of unnatural behavior among teens who had broken into the ruins. All exhibited identical symptoms: catatonia, repeating the same Latin phrase, "Non vocabis nomina quae non dormiunt." Translation: "Do not call the names that do not sleep." Father Dominic Verhoeven, a veteran of Vatican-sanctioned rituals, arrived with full support and ritual authority. The goal was to sanctify the basement chamber and destroy whatever imprint lingered. He descended with candles, oil, and a hand-bound grimoire of exorcism rites. He was gone 47 minutes. When he emerged, his robes were soaked, though it had not rained in days. His eyes were sunburned, and in his hands he carried the small wax doll Elias Green once described in 1836. He would not speak again. Verhoeven spent the last 6 years of his life in a private religious facility, drawing the same image again and again: the Whitmore staircase, each step carved with names, each descending into a mouth with no face. His final words were written, not spoken: "You cannot cast out what was invited." The exorcism failed because the Whitmores had not summoned a demon. They had contracted a god. In 2010, satellite thermal imaging of the region was conducted for a geological survey. One scan revealed a pocket of heat deep beneath the Whitmore estate, impossible for its depth and lack of seismic activity. Believing it to be a magma pocket or potential sinkhole, a team of geologists and spelunkers drilled a shaft. They never reached the heat source. But they did find a tunnel, straight, perfectly carved, and extending deeper than any of their equipment could safely map. It defied natural formation and appeared to have been burned into the rock itself, smooth like glass and warm to the touch. One scientist, Henry Surridge, descended against orders with a body cam. He reached 89 feet before signal was lost. The footage recovered from his device showed only one thing: Surridge entering a round. In 2021, near the outskirts of Marrow Creek, local police responded to a report of children walking in the fields after dark. When they arrived, they found 12 children, dressed in 1800s clothing, barefoot, silent, covered in dust. Their eyes unfocused, their skin ice cold. They were taken into custody, believed to be part of a historical reenactment or trafficking case. But the medical exams told a different story. No fingerprints, no dental records, bones malformed from starvation, blood types that hadn't been recorded in over a century. Each child bore a scar across the lips, some stitched, some cauterized. When shown photographs from the original 1836 case, 3 of the children matched the images carved on the walls. The names they gave were not modern. They claimed they had never died. They claimed they had waited. And when asked who brought them back, they all pointed down at the floor and said the same thing: the room still breathes. Today, the Whitmore estate is sealed, buried under layers of legislation and silence. No official tours, no documentaries with permission to film on site. What little remains of the house is cracked foundation and scorched earth. But the basement, it still exists, and it is not empty. Locals say they still hear the bell, low, faint, like someone ringing it far beneath the ground, asking for another offering. Animals avoid the land, children grow sick when brought too close, phones die, compasses spin, and still, every year, 1 child vanishes near Marrow Creek without explanation. The arrangement was never broken, just postponed, because contracts with old gods are not erased, they are renewed. And the Whitmore family? They were just the first to sign. The screams were never heard, but they were promised, and now that promise is due.